In the heart of a blinding November vortex on Lake Superior, a massive steel phantom looms over a dying wooden steamer. Below, 17 panicked sailors scramble into lifeboats, convinced they found a lifeline. High above, their captain refuses to surrender, anchored to a pilot house literally splintering into the abyss. By dawn, an unthinkable miracle emerges, but it defies every rule of survival. How does a man entombed in a shell of razor-sharp ice survive 20 hours in a zero-degree hell, while those in professional rescue craft vanish without a trace? Was this a freak of nature, or did a dark secret lurking within the ship's own cargo betray them all? Tonight, we haunt the frozen graveyard of Whitefish Point to deconstruct the chilling paradox of the SS Myron. Stay with us until the very end, as we reveal why the shortest distance to safety can sometimes be the cruelest trap of all. (1919) was a year defined by an insatiable hunger for expansion. In post-World War I America, cities like Detroit and Chicago were no longer merely growing. They were exploding skyward, fueled by an unprecedented construction boom. This industrial fever demanded a constant supply of its bone and marrow wood, and the Great Lakes served as the primary artery for this vital resource. Every season, millions of board feet of hemlock, pine, and hardwood were ferried across these treacherous waters. Within this massive economic engine, the SS Myron was an indispensable cog, a workhorse, operating in the shadows of more glamorous fleets, carrying the literal weight of American progress on her wooden back. She was a servant to a nation that, in its rush toward the future, had no time for caution. In 1888, at the Duncan Robertson shipyard in Grand Haven, Michigan, the SS Myron was launched under her original name, Mark Hopkins, a name bestowed upon her by the son of Captain Harris Baker, the first in a long lineage of owners. Built with the rugged simplicity of the late 19th century, she was a classic wooden steamer barge, measuring 186 feet in length, with a 32-foot beam and a 13-foot depth. Within her hull sat a double-expansion steam engine, a reliable heart for a ship designed for labor. But her defining characteristic was her role as a lumber hooker. In the maritime lingo of the lakes, a lumber hooker was essentially a maritime tractor. She was designed with enough power to not only carry a full load in her own hold, and piled high upon her decks, veneer, hemlock, and pine stacked nearly to the masts, but also to tow one or two heavily laden schooner barges behind her. This consort system was a masterpiece of industrial efficiency, allowing a single engine to move massive quantities of timber. But it came with a hidden cost. It significantly compromised maneuverability in heavy seas. It was a technical trade-off that prioritized profit over safety, a gamble that would eventually be called due. The Myron was no stranger to the cruelty of the lakes. She was a vessel born and reborn in struggle. On the 27th of September 1895, she actually sank in Hay Lake, near Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, following a collision. In a different era, her story might have ended there, resting at the bottom of the St. Mary's River. However, the hunger for shipping was so intense that she was salvaged just weeks later, on October 19, by Henry McMorran. After a thorough rebuild, she returned to the waves, and in 1902, she was officially renamed the SS Myron. For 31 years, this ship survived the brutal November gales and the razor-sharp ice of the spring thaws. By 1919, she had earned a reputation among the sailors of the Whitefish Point run as a reliable, albeit aging, veteran. However, beneath this veneer of resilience, a dangerous evolutionary gap was widening. By 1919, the Myron was a relic of a fading era, caught in the transition of eras. Massive 500-foot steel freighters were now beginning to dominate the lake's vessels designed to slice through waves that would shatter a wooden hull like glass. The Myron represented the last of the wooden titans, straining to keep pace with an industrial world that had outgrown her. To understand the danger she faced, one must understand the forensics of a wooden ship. Unlike a steel ship, which remains a rigid, singular unit under pressure, a wooden ship breathes. Her seams, held together by iron bolts and oakum caulking, are susceptible to working a constant rhythmic flexing and twisting caused by the heavy kinetic energy of the waves. After 30 years of service, the Myron's lungs were tired. Every time she crested a wave, her timbers groaned. Every time she dropped into a trough, her seams strained. In 1919, the Myron wasn't just fighting the weather, she was fighting the obsolescence of her own design. On the morning of the 22nd of November 1919, the SS Myron steamed out of the sheltered harbor of Munising, Michigan, destined for Buffalo, New York. To any casual observer watching from the frost-covered docks, it was a routine departure, one of hundreds, that occurred during the frantic end-of-season rush. Her wooden hold and decks were straining under the staggering weight of 700,000 board feet of hemlock lumber. This cargo represented a small fortune for her owners, the bone and marrow of a nation's relentless westward expansion. Following in her wake, tethered by a massive pulsing hemp tow line, was the schooner barge Miztec. She was the Myron's faithful consort, laden with her own massive timber load, a silent partner in a gamble against the calendar. Between these two vessels, 25 lives were at stake. 18 men aboard the Myron and 7 on the Miztec. For the first 2 hours, Lake Superior was deceptively calm, a glass-like mirror of gray sky. To grasp the nightmare that was about to unfold, one must first understand the lethal geography of Whitefish Point, known to generations of sailors as the graveyard of the Great Lakes. This region is not merely a place on a map, it is a geographical bottleneck of terrifying efficiency. Lake Superior is the largest freshwater lake on Earth by surface area, and when a northwest gale sweeps across its vast open expanse, it has hundreds of miles of fetch. In meteorological terms, fetch is the unobstructed distance. Wind travels over open water. As the wind moves, it transfers immense kinetic energy into the lake's surface. By the time these gales reach the eastern end of the lake, that energy is funneled and compressed into the narrow corridor of Whitefish Bay. The waves here do not just grow in height, they stack. They become steep, closely spaced walls of water with no room for a ship to recover between impacts. It was here that the Myron would encounter the legendary Three Sisters, a terrifying meteorological phenomenon where 3 massive rogue waves strike in rapid, rhythmic succession. The first wave hits with enough force to stun and bury the bow. The second arrives before the vessel can shed the water from the first, and the third delivers a crushing, terminal blow that can shatter a 30-year-old wooden hull like dry kindling. The storm, a true November gale, struck with a ferocity that defied even the veteran crew's collective experience. Within 2 hours of departure, the wind speed crested over 60 miles per hour, screaming through the Myron's rigging with the sound of 1,000 banshees. The temperature plummeted from a brisk autumn chill to a sub-zero freeze in minutes, turning the lake spray into a blinding whiteout of snow and crystalline ice. Visibility vanished instantly. The Myron was no longer navigating a lake. She was navigating a void where the horizon had ceased to exist, and the only reality was the rhythmic, violent hammering of the hull. As the seas began to batter the ship, a silent, forensic catastrophe began to take hold, what maritime investigators call the sponge effect. Hemlock on the cargo deck, unlike pine or hardwood, is exceptionally porous. Its cellular structure is designed to hold moisture, and when the 700,000 board feet of lumber stacked high upon the Myron's decks were subjected to constant submersion by the waves, they began to absorb the freezing lake water. This wasn't a matter of the cargo simply getting wet. The timber was becoming a literal, heavy extension of the lake itself. Every gallon of water absorbed added thousands of pounds of dead weight to the ship's upper decks. This created a state of dynamic overloading, where the ship's displacement was changing by the minute. The Myron was sinking into the lake not because of a hole in her hull, but because her own cargo was becoming too heavy for the laws of physics to support. She was being dragged deeper into the troughs, becoming sluggish, heavy, and dangerously unresponsive to the helm. Compounding this was a second, more visible enemy: spray ice. In the sub-zero temperatures, the lake water didn't wash off the ship. It flash froze upon the wooden superstructure, the masts, and the pilot house. This is a critical distinction in maritime safety. A leak in the hull adds weight to the bottom of a ship, which can actually increase stability for a time by lowering the center of gravity. However, spray ice accumulates at the top. This rapidly raised the Myron's center of gravity, fatally compromising her metacentric height. For the Myron, the danger had evolved from a risk of sinking to an extreme risk of a sudden, catastrophic capsize. She was becoming a top-heavy pendulum, swinging further and further with every wave, with less and less power to right herself. Inside the hull, the situation reached a breaking point. The Myron was a 31-year-old vessel, and her wooden seams, held together by iron bolts and oakum caulking, were subjected to the kinetic torsion of the waves. This is known as working the constant, rhythmic flexing and twisting of the timbers. After decades of service, the Myron's seams were failing. Water began to pour into the engine room through 1,000 tiny gaps. The steam pumps, designed only for minor, routine leaks, were hopelessly outmatched. As the water level rose beneath the floorboards, it reached the ash pits of the boilers. In a steamship, the boilers are the heart, and water in the ash pits is the first sign of a terminal cardiac arrest. The Myron's speed, once a steady and reliable pace, dropped to a crawling 3 to 4 knots, barely 5 miles per hour. She was no longer a vessel making headway. She was a floating coffin, drifting toward the inevitable. Near Vermilion Point, Captain Walter Neal was forced to make a harrowing, high-stakes choice. To give the Myron even a ghost of a chance at survival, he had to sacrifice her maneuverability's greatest burden. He gave the order to cut the tow line to the Miztec. In a moment of maritime drama that would haunt him for the rest of his life, the massive hemp rope was severed. The Miztec, suddenly unburdened, vanished into the whiteout. It was a decision born of absolute desperation, yet it contained a bitter, tragic irony. By cutting the line, the Miztec was able to drop her own heavy anchors and ride out the storm, her low profile allowing the wind to pass over her. She would ultimately survive the night. The Myron, now unburdened but fatally wounded and losing steam by the second, was left to face the Three Sisters alone. She was only 15 miles from the safety of Whitefish Point, a distance that, on a clear day, could be covered in 15 minutes. By the late afternoon of the 22nd of November, 1919, the Myron was not alone in her final hour. In an extraordinary display of maritime solidarity, two massive steel titans had converged on her position. These were the modern machines of the 20th century, the 520-foot HP Macintosh, commanded by Captain Lawrence, and the Adriatic, commanded by Captain McGaw. These ships represented the future of shipping. Their steel hulls were designed to brush off the very waves that were currently crushing the Myron's 30-year-old wooden ribs. The Adriatic made a maneuver that maritime historians still describe as heroic. Captain McGaw steered his massive steel bulk to the windward side of the Myron, intentionally positioning his ship as a giant breakwater. By doing this, the Adriatic took the direct hammering of the Lake Superior seas, creating a small temporary lee, a patch of relatively calmer water for the smaller wooden ship. It was a tactical shield, a desperate attempt to buy the Myron just a few more minutes of stability. Meanwhile, on the freezing shoreline, the lookouts at the Vermilion Life-Saving Station had spotted the struggle through brief breaks in the snow. Despite the suicidal conditions, the station crew launched their motor-powered surfboat. This tiny speck of human courage was thrust into a wilderness of gray water and 60-mile-per-hour winds, fighting an uphill battle to reach the Myron before the inevitable happened. But at 5 miles from safety, inside the hull, the water that had been seeping through the flexing wooden seams for hours finally breached the boiler room floor. This led to a catastrophic event that maritime engineers call thermal shock. It caused a violent, instantaneous molecular contraction of the metal. The sudden thermal shock likely caused the boiler casings to fracture or implode, releasing a titanic cloud of scalding steam that roared up through the vents and into the freezing air. In that instant, the Myron lost everything. Without steam, the pumps died, and the pumps were the ship's only defense against the lake. Without steam, the propeller stopped turning, and the vessel lost its steerage way, the ability to maintain a heading against the waves. In a span of just 4 minutes, the SS Myron gave up the ghost. She settled heavily into the water, and then, with a sickening groan of twisting timber and snapping iron bolts, she slipped beneath the surface of Lake Superior. As the Myron went down, the chaos shifted from a ship fight to a human fight. The crew of 18, prepared for this moment but terrified by its speed, managed to launch the 2 lifeboats. However, they were immediately thrust into a secondary nightmare, the lumber minefield. When the Myron sank, the 700,000 board feet of hemlock lumber on her decks didn't sink with her, because wood is naturally buoyant. Even when waterlogged, the cargo exploded upward as the ship descended. The water around the lifeboats was instantly transformed into a churning mass of heavy, jagged, and freezing timber. The sailors weren't just fighting the waves now, they were being battered by their own cargo. Every piece of hemlock became a potential battering ram, capable of crushing a lifeboat or a human skull with the force of the surging lake. The Adriatic and the HP Macintosh moved in to attempt a rescue, and it is here that the story shifts from a tragedy of nature to a profound tragedy of human limitation. Captain Lawrence of the Macintosh maneuvered his 520-foot vessel as close as he dared to the wreckage field. His crew stood on the deck, battling the wind to throw heaving lines, weighted ropes designed to be caught and used to pull survivors to the safety of the steel hull. These lines were thrown with precision. They landed across the lifeboats, literally within reach of the sailors' hands. The ropes hit their shoulders, draped over their laps, and floated in the water inches from their fingers. But no one grabbed them. Why did this phenomenon occur? Because the crew of the Myron had been soaked in sub-zero spray for hours before the sinking. In these temperatures, The human body undergoes peripheral vasoconstriction. This is a survival mechanism where the brain pulls blood away from the extremities, the hands and feet, to protect the core organs. The sailors' hands were no longer functional tools. They were frozen, swollen blocks of ice. They had lost all fine motor control. Their nerves were no longer firing, and their muscles had stiffened into rigidity. They could see the ropes. They could feel the weight of the lines hitting them, but their fingers refused to close. They were staring at salvation, but they were physically incapable of grasping it. It is perhaps the most haunting image. Men sitting in a lifeboat, watching the rope that could save them drift away because their bodies had already begun the process of shutdown. Witnessing this, a profound moral dilemma took hold of the captains of the steel ships, a court of conscience that would later be scrutinized by the government and the public. Captains McGaw and Lawrence faced a harrowing, impossible choice. To save the men, they would need to do one of two things: lower their own lifeboats or maneuver their massive steel ships directly into the center of the lumber field. But there was a terrifying technical risk: propeller fouling. If a single piece of that 700,000 board feet of floating hemlock lumber got caught in their propellers or jammed their rudders, the steel ships would lose all power. In those conditions, a 520-foot ship without power becomes an unguided missile. They would likely run aground, founder, and sink themselves, potentially killing their own crews of dozens to save the 18 from the Myron. Captain McGaw on the Adriatic attempted to make multiple passes, trying to use the suction of his ship's movement to draw the lifeboats closer. But the floating lumber acted as a barrier. The captains were forced to weigh the lives of their own men against the lives of the frozen sailors in the water. It was a cold, mathematical calculation of maritime law. The safety of the vessel and its own crew must always come first. Yet, as the captains watched the lifeboats drift further into the whiteout of Whitefish Bay, they knew they were delivering a death sentence. Both steel ships eventually pulled away. They stayed as long as they could, circling the perimeter of the lumber field. But the risk of losing their own vessels to the lumber minefield became too great. They were forced to watch as the Myron's lifeboats, filled with men too frozen to even wave goodbye, drifted away into the darkness. The Adriatic and the HP Macintosh steamed toward the safety of the Sulaks, carrying with them the heavy burden of what they had seen and what they had been unable to do. As the lights of the steel giants Adriatic and HP Macintosh finally vanished into the blinding whiteout of the 1919 Gale, a terrifying and absolute silence fell over the debris field of the SS Myron. It was a silence that was not truly quiet. It was composed of the rhythmic, visceral grinding of 700,000 board feet of hemlock lumber, clashing against itself in the swells and the mournful, high-pitched howling of the wind through the darkness. For the 17 men huddled in the two lifeboats, the departure of the steel ships was more than just a physical abandonment. It was the extinguishing of the last flickering light of hope. They were left to the mercy of a lake that had already decided their fate. But for one man, the battle for survival was just beginning, entering its most surreal and agonizing stage. Captain Walter Neal had not made it to the lifeboats. As the Myron plunged beneath the surface, the end had come with a violent, mechanical fury. As the wooden hull was swallowed by Lake Superior, the air trapped within the structure of the pilot house was rapidly compressed. It reached a critical pressure point where the internal air pocket sought an immediate escape in a final, violent act of the sinking ship. The pilot house was literally blown off the deck by this internal explosion, a phenomenon where the hull imploded while the superstructure exploded simultaneously. Neil, who had remained at his post until the final seconds, was thrust into the 32-degree water, only to surface alongside the very roof of the cabin he had just been standing in. He managed to scramble onto this fractured wooden island, a platform of Michigan oak and pine drifting alone in a wilderness of ice. For the next 20 hours, Walter Neal would become a living statue. As the freezing spray hit him, it didn't run off. It flash froze, coating his clothing, his beard, and his skin in a translucent, heavy shell of ice. To any observer, he would have appeared indistinguishable from the wreckage itself, a frozen gargoyle on a raft of timber. However, Neil possessed a survival instinct that bordered on the legendary. Throughout the night, he performed a singular, repetitive, and seemingly mundane action. He chewed tobacco. In the advanced stages of Stage 3 hypothermia, the human body begins to shut down non-essential functions. The muscles begin to seize, and lockjaw or trismus often sets in. For a survivor in the water, lockjaw is a death sentence. It makes it impossible to call out for help, to swallow, or even to breathe effectively through the mouth. By constantly working his jaw muscles to chew the tobacco, Neil kept the blood flowing to his facial nerves and forced the mechanical movement of his joints, preventing his jaw from freezing shut. It was a primitive but effective countermeasure against the cold that sought to turn him into a solid block of ice. He was fighting a war of attrition against the lake, one jaw movement at a time. At approximately 11:00 a.m. on November 23, nearly a full day after the sinking, the steamer WC France, commanded by Captain Jordan, was upbound from the Sulaks, navigating through the remnants of the storm. Through his binoculars, Jordan spotted a dark, irregular shape moving amidst a vast field of floating hemlock near Parisienne Island. At first, he thought it was merely more wreckage, but something about the shape's movement caught his professional eye. He launched a rescue boat, and as they drew closer, the rescuers realized with horror and awe that they were looking at a man. Captain Neal was found in a state of semi-consciousness, his body so heavily encased in a cocoon of ice that he had to be physically chipped away from the wooden roof with axes and hammers before he could be lifted into the rescue boat. He was the only soul left alive. But for Walter Neal, the miracle of life was immediately shadowed by the crushing weight of what psychologists now call survivor's guilt. He had watched his entire crew, men he had worked with, lived with, and commanded for years, launch in the supposed safety of the lifeboats, while he was left with nothing but a splintered piece of wreckage. Yet, the ocean's math is often cruel and counterintuitive. In a forensic analysis of the tragedy, the lifeboats, despite being designed for safety, became death traps. Because the sailors were sitting low in the water, the lifeboats acted as basins that caught the freezing spray. They were constantly drenched, and the water had nowhere to go. This turned their life jackets into heavy, frozen anchors, pinning them to their seats. Neal, on the other hand, was elevated slightly on the pilot house roof. The flat wooden platform allowed much of the water to drain away before it could freeze him into the structure, and the air pocket beneath the roof provided a slight, though marginal, insulation from the thermal sink of the lake. He had survived because he was on the wrong piece of the ship. The recovery of the crew in the following days was a process of slow, grinding horror. As the storm subsided and the lake grew eerily calm, the search for the Myron's lifeboats began. A tugboat owned by Frank Weston eventually discovered one of the boats drifting aimlessly in Whitefish Bay. What the rescuers found inside was a sight that would haunt the maritime community for decades. The boat was filled with the frozen bodies of the sailors, still sitting upright in their seats, their hands held out in front of them, as if they were still waiting to grasp the ropes from the Macintosh. The spray had frozen so thickly over the boat and its occupants that it looked like a macabre ice sculpture. The rescuers, including Dave Parrish and Jay Johnston, were forced to use axes to chop the ice away from the sailors' bodies just to remove them from the craft. They were later buried in a mass grave at Evans Mill, a silent, frozen testament to the 1919 gale. The image of those men frozen in the act of reaching for a salvation that never came remains the most enduring and tragic symbol of the Myron's end. However, the story of the SS Myron didn't end with the burials. It moved from the icy waters into the heated halls of maritime law. Captain Neal, fueled by a mixture of grief and a survivor's fury, filed a formal complaint against the captains of the Adriatic and the HP Macintosh. He accused them of cowardice and a catastrophic failure to uphold the most sacred law of the sea, the duty to rescue. The subsequent government investigation was one of the most intense and scrutinized in Great Lakes history. The authorities had to weigh a complex technical and moral equation. On one side was the technical risk of propeller fouling, the very real danger that the floating hemlock would destroy the rescue ship's engines and kill dozens more. On the other side was the moral and legal obligation to exhaust every possible means of rescue before abandoning souls to the water. In a landmark decision that sent shockwaves through the entire shipping industry, the government ruled against the steel ships. The licenses of Captain McGaw and Captain Lawrence were revoked. The message from the authorities was clear and uncompromising. The risk to the vessel does not absolve a captain of the duty to rescue. It was a verdict that redefined maritime responsibility in the 20th century. Today, the SS Myron rests in 50 feet of water, exactly 5 miles from the safety of the Whitefish Point lighthouse. Discovered in 1972, the wreck is a shattered debris field, a victim of both the thermal shock of her sinking and a century of Lake Superior's relentless currents. Her cargo of hemlock is still there, thousands of board feet of timber scattered across the lake floor, preserved in near-perfect condition by the sub-zero temperatures of the water. The lake, acting as a giant freshwater freezer, has kept the wood and the iron bolts in a state of suspended animation, a preserved classroom for the graveyard of the Great Lakes. For modern divers, the Myron is a popular but sobering sight. It serves as a physical reminder that in 1919, the rush for industrial progress was bought with the lives of men working on the edge of obsolescence. The Myron was a 19th century machine pushed into a 20th century storm, a workhorse that gave everything she had until her heart literally exploded. As we look back at the final minutes of November 22, we are left with the haunting image of Walter Neal on his wooden roof, a symbol of the terrifying, fragile boundary between life and death. The Myron remains not just a shipwreck, but a cold, clear warning that while technology and steel may change, the raw power of the lake and the weight of a captain's conscience remain eternal. The question that remains for us today is the same one that faced the captains of the Adriatic and the Macintosh. In the face of a lumber minefield, where does the duty to one's own crew end and the duty to a dying neighbor begin? The Myron provides no easy answers, only the silent, frozen evidence of the cost of that choice. As the lighthouse at Whitefish Point continues to sweep its beam across the bay, it passes over the resting place of 17 men who were within sight of the light, but worlds away from the shore. Finally, before concluding today's message, Thank you for honoring the legacy of the SS Myron with us. If this deep dive into the 1919 Gale moved you, please consider liking and sharing this video. Following our channel ensures that these haunting stories of the Great Lakes are never silenced by the passage of time. If you have a personal story or a reflection on this maritime tragedy, I invite you to join our community. In the comments below, your perspective matters. Until our next voyage into the mysteries of the deep, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.